There's a map of America that you've never seen, not because it's hidden in some government vault, though some of it is, but because the places on it were simply removed, quietly, officially, with the full weight of federal authority behind the decision. Streets that had names, schools that had children, neighborhoods where people built their lives from scratch, planted gardens, raised kids, buried their dead, and then one day, sometimes with notice, sometimes without, someone in a uniform or a suit said, "This place no longer exists. Move." What's strange isn't just that it happened. What's strange is how completely it worked. You can drive across some of these locations today and feel nothing unusual, just flat land, maybe some scrub brush, a chain-link fence with a federal warning sign, no trace of what was there. And that absence, that clean, deliberate absence, is exactly what we're here to examine. This isn't a list of abandoned places. Abandonment implies neglect. What happened to these towns was the opposite of neglect. It required planning, resources, legal architecture, and in some cases decades of sustained institutional silence. There's a difference between a town that died and a town that was erased. Every place on this list was erased. Number 6. Seneca Army Depot, New York. There's a stretch of the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York that most people drive past without a second thought. Seneca County. Rolling farmland, vineyards, the kind of landscape that feels quiet in a pleasant way. But if you know where to look, and most people don't, you'll notice the fences. Miles of them. And behind those fences, something that shouldn't exist. An entire abandoned military city. Seneca Army Depot was established in 1941. At its peak, it covered over 10,000 acres and housed a working community. Not just soldiers, but families. There were residential neighborhoods inside the perimeter. A hospital, a fire station, schools, a movie theater. People lived their whole childhoods here, in a place that technically didn't appear on public maps. The official purpose was ammunition storage, and that part was real. During World War II and through the Cold War, Seneca held enormous quantities of conventional weapons. But there were also persistent, heavily sourced rumors about something else stored here. Something nuclear. Former employees spoke about it decades later, carefully, with the particular kind of caution that comes from signing documents you never fully forget. What's confirmed is this. Seneca held the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons on the East Coast for a significant portion of the Cold War. The igloos, the rounded concrete bunkers still visible from satellite imagery, weren't just for artillery shells. The community living around them, the families going to school and shopping at the commissary, existed in geographic proximity to one of the most dangerous concentrations of weapons in human history. And they weren't always told. The depot was deactivated in 2000. Most of the structures still stand, which is its own kind of strange. A ghost town that looks almost functional, like everyone just stepped out for a moment. Some sections have been transferred to a nature preserve. Others remain closed. The explanations for why certain zones are still off limits are not particularly detailed. There's a herd of white deer that lives inside the perimeter now. A genetic quirk that was protected, almost accidentally, by decades of isolation. They roam through the empty streets, past the old administration buildings, through neighborhoods where kids once rode bikes. It's the kind of image that stays with you. This pale, silent presence moving through a town that was erased so completely that even the wildlife didn't get the memo. Number 5. Marana Air Base, Arizona. Most covert operations leave some kind of trace. A document that gets declassified 30 years later. A contractor who talks too much at a dinner party. A photograph in the wrong archive. What happened in Marana, Arizona is different, because the cover wasn't a secret facility in the desert. It was a functioning American town. Marana Air Base was built in the early 1940s as a civilian flight training center, but starting in the early 1950s, something shifted. The CIA, through a series of front companies, the most prominent being a firm called Intermountain Aviation, transformed this location into one of the most active covert air operations in the country. Pilots were trained here for missions that officially didn't exist. Aircraft were modified, tested, and deployed from this runway for operations across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. The unsettling part isn't the planes. It's the community. Around the base, a real town developed. Families moved to Marana. Kids went to school. People worked regular jobs, or appeared to. The social fabric of an ordinary American community grew up around an operation that was, at its core, a mechanism for conducting secret wars. Some people knew what was really happening, many didn't. The boundary between cover story and genuine civilian life became genuinely blurry, and that blurriness was intentional. A real town is better camouflaged than any fence. When the CIA's presence wound down, the transition was quiet. The front companies dissolved. People moved away. The documentation of what actually occurred there is still fragmentary. There are gaps in the public record that aren't accidental. They're the shape of deliberate removal. What remains in Marana today is a functional general aviation airport. Ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of place you'd never look twice at, which, if you think about it, is exactly how it was designed to be. Number 4. Frenchman Flat, Nevada. This one is harder to sit with. In the early 1950s, the U.S. government built a neighborhood in the Nevada desert and then vaporized it. Not once, multiple times. They rebuilt it and destroyed it again. They called it Apple II. They called it Doom Town. The official term was survival structures testing. What it was a furnished American suburb constructed specifically to be annihilated by atomic weapons. And the details of what they put inside it are genuinely disturbing. Framed photographs on the walls. Canned food in the kitchen cabinets. Department store mannequins posed at dining room tables, some dressed in clothing, some in pajamas. Mannequin children in mannequin beds. A mannequin family eating a mannequin dinner, 2 miles from a nuclear detonation. The stated purpose was to understand how civilian structures and populations would fare in a nuclear strike. Data that could inform civil defense planning. There's a logic to it. The logic doesn't make the images less haunting. What's less discussed is the geography. The Nevada test site sits in the Great Basin, where the prevailing winds carry fallout northeast, across southern Utah, Colorado, reaching as far as the eastern seaboard under the right conditions. The communities in that path, Cedar City, Utah, particularly, experienced elevated rates of cancer for decades afterward. Residents called themselves downwinders. They filed lawsuits. They documented their losses. The government's acknowledgement of what happened to them came slowly, partially, and in some cases not at all. The structures at Frenchman Flat still exist. The blast-damaged houses, the crumbled bank vault, the bent steel infrastructure, all of it is still out there in the desert, behind a perimeter that is not open to the public. The radiation levels on the site remain measurably elevated. Not enough to stop a visit by the government's accounting, but enough that they prefer you don't make one. Somewhere out there, in those ruins, there are still mannequin fragments, still canned goods in collapsed cabinets, still the residue of a staged American life that was built to be destroyed. And walking the perimeter of that site, even from a distance, you get this specific, uncomfortable feeling that the exercise wasn't really about learning how to protect civilians. It was about learning how much destruction was acceptable. Number 3. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Centralia didn't end with a decree, it ended with smoke. In 1962, a fire was set in a landfill on the edge of town, a controlled burn that was a routine practice at the time. The problem was what the landfill sat on top of, an exposed seam of anthracite coal that ran beneath most of the town. The fire caught the seam, and the seam didn't go out. It's been burning for over 60 years. It is still burning right now, today, beneath the ground of what was once a town of over 1,000 people. For the first decade, Centralia tried to contain it. The attempts failed. By the late 1970s, sinkholes had begun to open in backyards. Carbon monoxide was seeping into basements. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was crossing his grandmother's yard when the ground opened beneath him. A sinkhole, superheated, venting toxic gas directly upward. He grabbed a tree root on the way down and held on until his cousin pulled him out. After that, the federal government allocated funds to relocate residents. Most took the buyouts. Some refused. Here's where Centralia becomes more than a disaster story. The state of Pennsylvania eventually condemned all remaining properties and invoked eminent domain to force out the holdouts. The zip code was revoked. The Postal Service stopped delivering mail. The state worked methodically to eliminate every legal and administrative trace of Centralia as a functioning municipality. A small number of residents stayed anyway, fought in court. Some won the right to remain in their homes for their lifetimes, after which the properties revert to the state. The town that exists there now is a handful of elderly people, some cracked roads, grass growing up through asphalt, and steam rising from fissures in the earth. The fire beneath them is expected to burn for another 250 years. There's a stretch of old Route 61 outside Centralia that was closed because the ground beneath it buckled and cracked from the heat. Nobody repaved it. It just sits there. Warped pavement, graffiti accumulating over the years, steam venting from the cracks, surrounded by trees. A road to a place that was officially dissolved. You can walk it. People do. It's one of the stranger things you can do in Pennsylvania. Number 2. Atomic City, Idaho, EBR1 zone. There's a specific kind of desolation on the Snake River Plain in southern Idaho. The ground is flat, volcanic. The sky is enormous and indifferent. And scattered across this landscape, if you know the coordinates, are the remnants of something that was, for a brief period in the 1950s, genuinely historic and genuinely catastrophic. The National Reactor Testing Station, later renamed the Idaho National Laboratory, was the location where the United States conducted more nuclear reactor experiments than anywhere else on Earth. At its peak, there were over 50 experimental reactors operating across this stretch of desert. 50. Some were small, some were not. Around this facility, a community grew. The town of Atomic City, and yes, that was the real name. Incorporated in 1947, and at its peak had around 300 residents. People who worked at the facility lived there. Families. A post office. The kind of modest, earnest American optimism that characterized a lot of post-war settlement in the West. In 1961, reactor SL-1 exploded. It was the first fatal nuclear accident in U.S. history. 3 operators died. The cause involved a control rod being withdrawn manually. Too far. Too fast. What followed was a steam explosion that killed everyone in the building and contaminated the site so severely that the bodies of the 3 men couldn't be recovered without protective equipment. One of them was found pinned to the ceiling by a reactor component. The cleanup took months. The remains were buried in lead-lined coffins. The accident wasn't what ultimately ended the community. The slow economic contraction of the facility, automation, changing research priorities, those were the real causes of Atomic City's decline. The population today is around 25 people, maybe fewer. But what the SL-1 accident did was something more subtle. It changed how the surrounding community understood what it was living next to. The optimism of the 1950s, the genuine belief that nuclear energy was just electricity waiting to be harvested, didn't survive contact with what happened in that building. The town didn't die in one moment. It just quietly lost the reason it had believed in itself. The remnants of SL-1 are still buried on the INL site, in a disposal pit, classified as radioactive waste. The reactor that killed 3 men in 1961 is still out there in the Idaho desert, a few feet underground, inaccessible and unvisitable and largely forgotten outside the history of nuclear engineering. Number 1. The place that still has no name. Everything up to this point has had a name, a location, a record however partial, however redacted. What comes next is harder to describe, because the documentation around it is still classified, or destroyed, or never created to begin with, depending on which version of events you find more credible. Deep in the Nevada desert, beyond the Nevada test site, beyond Area 51's public perimeter, there are coordinates that appear on no civilian map in any useful form. Former Department of Energy contractors have described facilities in this region that housed not just weapons research, but something closer to permanent installation. Underground structures, extended residential capacity, infrastructure suggesting long-term occupation. Not temporary, not experimental, operational. The satellite imagery available through commercial platforms shows, for certain coordinates in this region, deliberate blurring, not the natural pixelation of low-resolution coverage. Deliberate applied blurring, consistent with federal requests to mapping services to obscure specific locations. Google Maps complies with these requests. It has, in documented cases, done so for years. What this means is that there are places within the continental United States whose current appearance cannot be independently verified through any tool available to a private citizen. You can drive near them. You can be stopped, questioned, and turned around by personnel with federal authority, but no obligation to identify themselves or their agency. The land looks empty. The signs say it's empty. The legal framework says you have no right to verify whether that's true. Whether these locations contain active towns, communities of workers, of contractors, of people living under classification agreements, is something we genuinely don't know. Former intelligence officials have acknowledged, in general terms, that classified residential communities exist within the U.S. national security infrastructure. The specifics remain unavailable. Here's what I keep thinking about. Somewhere, right now, there may be people living in a town that doesn't exist on any map. People with kids, people with routines, people who go to work and come home and make dinner and know as a background fact of their lives that they cannot describe where they live to anyone outside the perimeter. And when their assignment ends, when the program ends, or gets restructured, or gets canceled, they will leave. The town will continue, or it won't, and the rest of us will never know it was there. That's not a conspiracy. That's documented policy applied to its logical extreme. There's something we tend to assume about the country we live in, that its shape is fixed, that its geography is public, that the places within it exist in some shared, verifiable reality, that if something is there, it can be seen, that if it's real, it has a name. These towns prove otherwise. Some were built to be sacrificed. Some were built to disappear. Some were simply swallowed by the infrastructure of secrecy so gradually that no one person made the decision to erase them. It just happened as a consequence of 100 smaller decisions, none of which looked like erasure from the inside. What's left, in most cases, is nothing you'd recognize as absence. Just land, fences, the occasional anomaly in satellite imagery if you know what you're looking for. The map we all share is a version of reality that has been, in specific places, deliberately edited, and the editors are still at work.